All right, now let's take a little look at the history of science fiction, dating all the way back to the 1600s. Some of the biggest names a lot of you may have heard, especially if you're into science fiction. Three of the biggest, of course, are Mary Shelley, Julius Verne, and H.G. Wells. Um, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells are extremely well known for, as well as Mary Shelley, of course. Um, they all had major impacts on science fiction, as well as a fair amount of input, let's say, to the industry and how it was formed. So those are three names that I think everyone should know about science fiction. So I just wanted to make sure I mention them. I have two of them on the screen here, and the other one is one of our readings later on. So just wanted to quickly touch on that. But if you look back as early as the 1600s, Kepler was actually considered by many as one of the first science fiction stories. It was about a story to the moon. And if you think about that time period and how long ago we're talking about, that's impressive distance back in time for a science fiction story. Gulliver's Travel back in the 1700s. We've had movies made about that in much more recent history, as an example. And that one, so that was good to see a story from that far back come back into mainstream cinema in relatively recent history. And then, of course, Frankenstein. Probably one of the most legendary science fiction stories, and definitely one of the driving forces, along with H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, for really opening people's minds to where science fiction can go. And these were both written before the 1900s, and one, of course, early 1800s, and one towards the end. But Frankenstein, I can't even count how many different Frankenstein movies or offshoots there have been based on Frankenstein. And the War of the Worlds, many of you may remember that one, the more recent one. There was no original, but the more recent one with what's his name? How am I forgetting it? From Mission Impossible. Oh my gosh, that's funny. Tom Cruise. Sorry, wow, having one of those nights. Hopefully you all remember those movies, or at least can see how it's applied to today's cinema. Now, when science fiction really started to explode, though, was the pulp magazine era. Amazing Stories was a big publication, and it's the one that sort of really opened the fantasy aspect of it, of really going out there and getting away from the hard science side of it, definitely, and just like, for example, the Buck Rogers story, which has been retold many a times, and it was also a driving force behind a lot of comic strips and periods like that, and it definitely helped start to popularize the writing and it's what led to more sophisticated authors writing science fiction. So extremely important time, but also one that got very heavily criticized, which I'll talk about in a minute. The golden age of science fiction is where, for example, the pulp fiction got really heavily criticized, because they really tried to focus more on hard science and viewed accuracy as very important, but the fantasy aspect of it was a driving force behind science fiction, if you really think about it. So, but they were very heavily criticized, and the author quality did start to increase in the 1930s, not in the sense of the concept, but in the detail and writing skills of the authors themselves became far more advanced, and it only continued on. The next generation, which was known as the golden age of science fiction, which everyone talks about. Having said that, the golden age for me it fluctuates and lasted a long time, but it's a little bit of a misleading term to me, because for me the pulp fiction era was really the real jumping point for the genre. In the 1930s to the 60s were very important, but there were many important periods for science fiction. So that's the only reason I mention that, is that I find the term the golden age a little bit misleading sometimes. The Beat generation was the 60s and 70s. That opened up a whole new writing style. The concept of the new wave was part of that, and they brought in hard science fiction, but also you got to see again soft science fiction pioneered to a different level. So you got to see a bit of a diversification. The one I grew up with a bit more was definitely the cyberpunk era, which for me was also a lead to a lot of the good beginning science fiction movies, or ones that a lot of people really enjoyed, like Blade Runner and Total Recall. For those of you who haven't seen those, Blade Runner has Harrison Ford as the star in it, and it's directed towards the idea of telling the, real humans from not humans, and it was actually quite an interesting story, and one that a movie that I recommend that everybody watch. And then Total Recall was definitely a softer science fiction about living on Mars, and but dealt more with social issues and mistreatment of different peoples and different cultures and things like that, and alien races. And then, of course, Star Wars franchise, which everyone already knows I'm a super huge fan of, and we'll talk about in the genre about being a space opera and what that really means. And then the 90s, you got in. Star Trek The Next Generation was a big impact on shows, and it sort of took a little bit more strong approach towards the science. If you think about it, if you ever watch Star Trek, especially the TV show, I mean, literally half the episodes had a lot to do with science challenges or technology-based challenges or issues, or how they had to overcome technology to win battles and stuff like that. So it was definitely more focused on the science side of it. Okay, as well as in the 90s, they really started getting into the nanotechnology and bio improvements, and you got to see a whole whack of different movies as well as books written in those genres, which really hadn't been seen to the same level before. So it was quite good. Plus, you also had the internet was starting to become understood, which opened up a whole lot of doors as well.